Do you know what factors you should consider when choosing a frame rate for filming underwater? No? Don't worry, stick around, and in today's video we'll talk about what those factors are. Coming up. Hi and welcome back to the Underwater Filmmaking School and today's Back to Basics episode. Now this episode today is kind of like a second part to a Back to Basics episode we released 2 weeks ago. If you haven't seen the one I'm talking about, it's gonna be linked up here. Go and check it out first and then come back to this video here. Now in this previous video I talked about what frame rates I use for filming underwater, and basically it's 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second, and I gave you the explanation that I choose those frame rates based on whether I want to slow down that footage in post-production for cinematic value or for added stability in my footage. Now, obviously that is not the only reason or the only factor that is to be considered when we choose our frame rates. And quite a few of you guys picked up on that and left comments in the comment section to that video. So in today's video, I wanna follow up on that first video and give you the other factors that are important when we choose our frame rate. If you're working on a project where you have several cameras recording, you always want to make sure that all the cameras have the same frame rate. Now, if let's say you're shooting with 25 frames per second, that doesn't mean that every single camera has to have 25. You can also have a camera shooting with 50 frames per second or 100 frames per second, but you want to make sure that they are all in multiples of each other when it comes to the frame rates. Another factor that needs to be considered when picking your frame rate is what is going to be your project frame rate, the frame rate that you're going to be putting and importing all your footage to. Let's say in your editing software you're using a 24 frames per second timeline. In that case, obviously it makes sense to shoot the footage that you're going to be importing into that project also in 24 frames per second or a multiple of that. Now, personally, I use 60 frames per second a lot on a 24 frames per second timeline. Now I know that some of you out there will say that this is not a good idea, that you can, it drops frames and it can get jumpy if you do that. My personal opinion and my personal experience also is that I have never really had any issues, at least not with my GH5 footage and also not with the Osmo Action footage that I generally use. I've never had any issues with importing 60 frames per second into a 24 frames per second timeline and slowing it down by 60%. So just see for yourself what works best for you, but make sure that whatever frame rates you're shooting, they're always a multiple of what the frame rate is that you're actually working on in your editing software. Shutter speed is another factor that needs to be considered, because obviously the higher the frame rate is that you're choosing, the quicker the shutter speed is going to be, which basically means there's going to be less light getting into or onto your sensor. So if you're shooting in a low light situation, it might be advisable not to shoot in higher frame rates, but rather stick to 24, 25, 30 frames per second, so that you can make sure to get plenty of light, or the most available amount of light onto your sensor, and not having to crank up the ISO to get a proper exposure on your images. Now when we talk about shutter speed, we also need to talk about the 180-degree shutter speed rule. Basically, you should always have your shutter speed at double your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, my shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. And if I shoot with 100 frames per second, that should go up to 1/200th of a second. This is a general rule that applies to filming on land, and I also stick to that rule for most of the time when it comes to filming underwater. A exception from that rule is if I'm filming any screens underwater, for example, a dive computer, a camera screen, and I want to avoid flickering on my images, on my footage, I need to be able to, or I need to actually adjust my, my shutter speed slightly to be able to get rid of that flickering. And there you have it. Those are the factors that I would additionally consider when picking a frame rate for my underwater filming adventures. Hopefully this video was useful to you and you got something out of it, and I hope I was able to answer the questions that came up in the last video as well. If that's the case, please do not forget to hit that like button. You know it means a lot to all of us. Also consider to subscribe to the channel, including the little notification bell, so you do get notified whenever we publish a new video here in the future. If you need more inspiration, more tips and tricks on how to improve your underwater filmmaking, make sure to check out our tips and tricks for underwater filmmaking playlist. We'll link it up here in the corner. Feel free to go and check that out. It is filled with tons of useful information that will help you become a better underwater filmmaker. Thank you very much for your time and watching all the way through the end. Happy diving, stay safe, and I will see you next time.